This is Duke University.
Welcome. I'm Matthew Raskoff. Very glad to have you here. For the stragglers, if you don't mind just coming in quietly and taking one of the seats in the back rows. We are thrilled to welcome Tim Renick here to share thoughts as part of the Next Ed Festival of Learning. We're going to talk today about closing achievement gaps using data and analytics. I just wanted to frame a little bit of the conversation for us and also tell you a little bit more about who Tim is. So this is part of our month-long Festival of Learning called Next Ed. This week has a grand challenge, and each week in the Next Ed Festival has an associated grand challenge. This week's focus is diversity, community, and inclusion. We've done a series of events this week, as we've done every week, including a student panel on first-generation students at Duke, really eye-opening and impressive students sharing their experience about what it's like to be first-generation here, which 1 out of 11 undergraduates are. Just that fact, I think, was pretty surprising. We did another event on the Teaching for Equity Fellows program, and we had alumni out of Teaching for Equity Fellows sharing their experience coming through that program and the impact that it's had on their teaching. And Tim Renick is going to help us close out the week by thinking about the achievement gap and our responsibility for closing it. I wanted to share a little bit about who Tim is, because I think it's important for understanding his message for us and understanding what it might mean for Duke. So Tim has a really long and interesting biography. I want to pull out a few parts of it. So his job is that he's Vice President for Enrollment Management and Student Success, as well as Vice Provost and Professor of Religious Studies at Georgia State University. He was Chair of the Department of Religious Studies, but since 2008, he's led student success and enrollment management efforts at the university, and he's overseen the fastest improving graduation rates in the nation and the elimination of all achievement gaps based on students' race, ethnicity, and income level. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But deeper in his past and further down in his experience, you'll see that Tim is the product of classical education, religion, and theology. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College and got his PhD from Princeton University in religion. So how does a graduate in religion, a PhD graduate in religion, become one of the leading lights of the student success movement, who's been honored at the White House and has received prizes from Washington Monthly, from the Student Success Innovation Group, National Leadership in Student Success? What is the story there? That was the question that I posed to myself in figuring out how to introduce it. And I went, since I worked in the library, I went hunting for his past, and especially for his publications. And here's what I found, and I think it's an important message for us. I found an essay that he wrote about his teaching philosophy, which was about coming to Georgia State from Princeton in the 1980s. And what he wrote then was that I steadfastly refused to dumb down the material, in many cases assigning the same pieces that I had read as a student at Dartmouth and Princeton to my students at Georgia State. Later in that same piece, he wrote, teaching is finding ways to present the material so as to engage with very best students, but also teaching is addressing the needs of all of our students, less talented students as well, and the whole community. He views teaching as part of this community enterprise that involves the classroom that goes well beyond the classroom. The seeds of his work, I think, are visible in that earlier piece. In 1998, he published a piece about the moral philosophy of cloning, and he was thinking about the implications of technology for research and for what we do, what the limits of technology and what the responsibilities associated with technology might be. In 1991, he wrote a piece called From Apartheid to Liberation, Calvinism and the Shaping of Ethical Belief in South Africa. He was contending with the implications of religion for the gaps associated with apartheid South Africa, still apartheid South Africa when he wrote that piece. So he was thinking about these issues of gaps and inequality in his research and his religious scholarship earlier on. To me, I think the message is that, I've been working in digital learning. We talk about career switchers all the time. It's a message about the transformative power of people. And I think that's a hopeful sign for the transformative power of institutions, because institutions are made up of people. But the complexity is that that transformation has to draw on who we are, and it has to draw on our values. And that is, I think, the hope for institutions of higher education like ours, that we can be transformed, we can be relevant, we can serve new audiences in ways that we need to, while still remaining rooted in who we are, in our values, in what we've always done. That, I hope, is a message that resonates with you. It's certainly one that resonates with me. So with that, please join me in welcoming Tim Renick to Duke University.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. Good afternoon. If I had known that Matthew would be reading articles I wrote 35 years ago, I might have thought twice about accepting his kind invitation, but that was very thoughtful and actually quite astute, because people often ask how I became somebody who now is known in student success circles, because I was a religious studies faculty member for 25 years of my career. And it really is the fact that my area of study within religious studies is religious ethics, and I was seeing day to day, working with students very closely. Many of our classes are small, and I got to know the students very well, just how badly we were failing our students in all kinds of ways that I thought could be corrected. And so the story I'm going to tell this afternoon is one of institutional transformation. Hopefully it's one that has resonance for the theme of the week. It's also one that I think has some resonance to a larger national conversation about what's possible with students from underserved backgrounds, because some of what we've been doing, we were told as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, absolutely couldn't be done. That, you're not going to be able to attain these goals. And I'm going to start by trying to explain why there's the skepticism out there. This is national data. It's actually from the New York Times. It's based on a Stanford study. It's the percent of Americans who actually hold the bachelor's degree disaggregated by economic quartile. It covers the last 40 years from 1970 all the way up to the present. What you can see, even if you're in the back of the room, there have been significant changes in bachelor's attainment over the last generation, but entirely in the upper half of the economic spectrum. If you're among the 25% wealthiest Americans by annual household income, your prospects of holding a college degree have basically doubled over this time period. It was about 40% of the population about in 1970. Now we're up over 80%, which is great. We want to celebrate that. But it's not the story of Georgia State. It's not the story of what we've been working on for the last decade. Our story, centers upon those bottom bands, especially that bottom 25%. And there you can see the picture is very different and much more sobering. Right? In 40 years, we've moved the needle hardly at all, from about 6% now to about 8 or 9% of the population holding a bachelor's degree. And the gap between the least wealthy and wealthiest Americans, as you can see graphically there, is not narrowing, it's getting wider. It's basically doubled over the last 40 years. So take those national data and add to them these. We've crossed an important threshold over the last 5 years in the United States. For the first time in our history, at least since these data have been collected, the majority of K through 12 public school children across the United States now qualify as low income. Right? And you can see the states where that leading edge has already occurred. Georgia's clearly in the, among the top 10, but North Carolina not far behind. In fact, if you draw a line across the United States from about California to the DC area, almost every state below that line has already crossed the threshold. More than half the school-age children in public schools are classified as low income. So you put those two national data sets together, and it should give all of us some pause and concern. Because on the one hand, we have not figured out as a nation how to succeed in graduating low-income students from higher education. On the other hand, the pipeline coming forward, that is the nature of the pipeline coming forward, predominantly low income. It's also a good introduction to my home campus, Georgia State University. That's not just a pretty picture of the Atlanta skyline. That is our campus. The white building on the right there is our largest academic building. Beside it, our business school, our law school, and so forth. There's no campus. We're just mixed into downtown Atlanta. Any of you who've been to conventions downtown, you're about 5 blocks away from Georgia State. 34,000 students on that campus alone. We also have satellite campuses, so we're about 53,000 students in total this fall. My story this afternoon is going to be about our efforts on that main campus in downtown Atlanta. And the reality is, for much of our history, we were a sleepy commuter school, and we've been overshadowed by more prominent schools in our midst. So we're not Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech is the very elite, highly selective public university about a mile and a half away from us. We're not University of Georgia. That's the big football powerhouse that was in the national championship last year. Emory is about 5 or 6 miles away from us, elite private. If there's any claim to fame to Georgia State historically, it may be our geography. We have the very distinct luxury, distinction of being a campus that has a National Park Service historic district bisected in half. The Auburn Avenue Martin Luther King Historic District cuts Georgia State's campus in half. The office I work in every morning is about 4 blocks from that brick building at the bottom of the screen there. That's Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King and his father before him were both head pastor. You walk up past Ebenezer Baptist, you get to his gravesite. A few blocks after that, you get to that kind of mustard-colored house up there. That's his childhood home. So we're living and working every day at Georgia State in this geography that is infused with historical significance. But for much of Georgia State's history, we did not live up to that legacy. We were a segregated campus well into the 1960s, so the sad irony there. This Nobel Prize, Peace Prize winning a civil rights leader is literally 3 or 4 blocks away from an institution which itself is the very embodiment, of the problems he's fighting against. But even much more recently, this is 15 years ago, these were our so-called success rates at Georgia State. And for those of you not familiar with large urban campuses, we were not an outlier. Our graduation rates hovered around 30%. 7 out of 10 students were coming with hopes and dreams and leaving, with debt and nothing to show for it. We were a classic example of the so-called achievement or equity gaps, meaning that every semester, semester after semester, year after year, the white students would graduate at better rates than the students of color. The middle and upper income students would graduate at better rates than the low income students. You could set your clock to it. You didn't even have to run the numbers. You just knew that that was the way it was going to be. And what makes Georgia State's story distinctive and hopefully worthy of our conversation is some of these trends. This is the percent of our student body that is non-white. We've gone through significant demographic changes at Georgia State. When I arrived 30 years ago as a junior faculty member right out of grad school, it was a majority white campus. 70% of the student body was white, lots of adult students who took classes after they worked in downtown Atlanta. About a decade ago, we became officially designated an MSI, Minority Serving Institution, where now we have no majority population. The largest single group are African American students, about 39%. 2 fastest growing groups are Asian American and our Hispanic Latino students. So we've gone through these significant demographic changes over a short period of time. It's also the case that our students became a lot less well-resourced financially. So over this time period, we moved from an institution where about 1/3 of our students qualified as low income to now where it's about 60%. The recession hit Atlanta very hard. We were a boom city before the recession. At one point during the recession, Atlanta had at the same time both the highest unemployment rate and the highest default rate on home mortgages of any urban area in the United States. And the families that were hit by these kind of economic trends, at least hit hardest, were not the sons and daughters families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia Tech and to the University of Georgia and to Emory, which tends to enroll the upper half of the economic spectrum. They were the students of color. They were the first-generation students and so forth who go to Georgia State. And so in a 5-year period, we literally doubled the number of low-income students we enroll. This is designating the low-income by Pell status. The average Pell family in America last year came from an annual household income of about $25,000 a year. So all of these students are basically in the lowest band of that first New York Times chart we were looking at just a minute ago. These are the students that higher education has historically failed across the United States. And those are our student body now. So many of the conferences I go to, so many of my colleagues at other institutions talk about doing a program for the low-income students they enroll. Well, at Georgia State, with 60% of a student body across all our campuses, that's 53,000 students, this fall we're enrolling 28,900 Pell students. The entire Ivy League combined this fall enrolls about 9,800 Pell students. So Georgia State is trying to educate almost 3 times the number of low-income students as the entire Ivy League combined. It's not going to be a program, right? You're not going to create a program for almost 30,000 students. You're just going to have to change the institution, change the way it works for all students. A couple other details about the last 10 or so years. We have not been getting more selective. So, it's not often that you'll see a vice president for enrollment standing in front of a slide like this. Look at our declining SAT rate. But it's actually a badge of honor, in my view. We made a conscious effort a decade ago to broaden, not limit, our admissions criteria because there was a real need in the state of Georgia. Part of it was that admissions to Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia had gotten ridiculously competitive. This fall at Georgia Tech, the average incoming SAT scores, combined verbal and math, are 1470, average. And the average high school GPA at the University of Georgia is like a 4.1 because of bonus points and so forth. So you have to be in the top, 2 or 3% of your graduating class to get into those institutions. Where are the students going to go who do everything right that we tell them to do? Stay in high school, plug away, get good grades. You may not be the best scholar in your high school, but you're college bound. Well, not unless we make some public policy adjustments. And Georgia State was approached by the state of Georgia saying, are you willing to grow and accommodate more and more of these students? And we were. The other thing that we don't, we don't have more of now than we had when we started this story was state resources. So because the recession hit state of Georgia hard, it also led to some very steep cuts in our appropriations. And so the appropriations we have at the end of this story is actually $40 million less than the appropriations we had at the beginning of the account. So what do you do under these circumstances? You're an institution, you have a commitment to your students, they're already struggling, too many are dropping out, and you've had these huge demographic changes, a reduction in resources, reduction in incoming academic preparation. It's easy to point fingers, and that's the first reaction that most of us had at Georgia State. Blame K through 12, right? When public education in Georgia gets better, then we'll graduate more students, because they're coming to us underprepared, and they are. I mean, there's no doubt. By most national standards, public education in Georgia is not highly performing. Or blame the legislature. When they stop slashing us $8 million a year, as they did for 5 consecutive years, then maybe we'll be able to turn these numbers around. But what Georgia State did about a decade ago, initially it was very uncomfortable, and then it became liberating, was to begin to talk publicly about something that we don't often talk about in higher education, our failures. And we began to pose a simple question. Are we the problem? How are we contributing to the fact that 7 out of 10 students were coming to Georgia State and leaving with nothing to show for it other than debt? We got much better at data. We invested in data even as the state was cutting our appropriations so that we could really put the mirror on ourselves and do some analysis of what is going wrong with this whole enterprise. Where are students getting tripped up? Can we use the data to identify those places? And then can we use data to track our interventions? We began piloting small interventions to deal with whatever the problem we identified was, and then scaling those solutions across the whole campus if they proved to be effective. So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is walk you through what might be called the student life cycle. What's happened in aggregate over the last decade is we've really changed the way Georgia State students experience the university. Their experience from the time they first encounter the university is quite different. So I'm going to walk you through the different stages of the student life cycle and just talk about how it may look different today than it did in the past and how these differences may be helping us speak to equity issues across our student body. One example is the issue of summer melt. I don't know how familiar this room is with that term. It's a relatively new one. Summer melt refers to the phenomenon of students who do everything right. They graduate from high school, apply to college, get into college, confirm they're going to college, but who don't show up to college, right? It's not the phenomenon which places like Duke struggle with as well, as students get admitted to Duke but end up going potentially to some rival institution. These are students who get admitted and confirm they're coming and don't go to college at all. In the summer of 2015, so we're just talking about 3 years ago, the summer melt level at Georgia State had climbed to 19%. And there's some really good studies out there. There's a great book by Lindsay Page called Summer Melt, which looks at this phenomenon. It's particularly prevalent in urban areas, in urban high schools. What we did is we had a group of students who we were expecting to be in their classes, in their seats, the first day of classes for fall 16, for fall 15, who just didn't show up. And so we did an analysis. We used National Student Clearinghouse data to track these students for a 12-month period, asking where they ended up. Maybe they did end up at some other institution. We found that 12 months later, there were almost 300 students who were confirmed and registered for classes at Georgia State for the fall semester 2015 who hadn't attended a single day of post-secondary work anywhere across the United States. They just melted away during the summer. They had done everything to prepare to go to college. They had signaled that they were going to go to college. They just didn't do so. And there's the profile of the students. Mostly students of color, mostly low income, really good high school students. These are not borderline graduates. They finished high school with a B+ GPA. These are exactly the students we need to succeed with as a nation, but something's happening in those 3 months between graduating from high school and starting college that is causing them to change their mind and to change their plans. So leading up to the summer of 2016, we did an analysis, and the something that was happening to them was basically us. You know, all our bureaucracy, all the hoops we make students jump through. And not just Georgia State, but most institutions. We did an inventory. We found that there were 14 different things we expected students to do in order to be ready for the start of fall classes. Things like complete the FAFSA. Some of you in the room may have children, sons and daughters who have done that. Some of you have probably completed it yourself in recent semesters. It's not the kind of thing that the average 17-year-old is going to master on their own. It's basically like an IRS form. And yet we're expecting students to complete that. The verification request, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. But just like the IRS runs algorithms when you submit your taxes, and if your taxes look like outliers for somebody at your income level and your profession and so forth, you're more likely to get pulled out for an audit. So too the federal government audits the FAFSAs, the federal applications for student aid. And if you're the son or daughter of a middle-income family and your parents file a joint return, very unlikely to get one of these verification requests. But if you're being raised by your grandmother because your biological dad isn't in the financial picture, you're much more likely to get a verification request. And again, what 17-year-old from any background is going to respond effectively in the middle of July for a request from the federal government that says, we need written verification that your grandmother is your legal guardian and that your father is not contributing to the finances of your family? And what we found, not surprisingly, is there were a subset of students that were taking this request, sticking it in their pocket and saying, guess I'm not going to college after all. The state of Georgia mandates immunization records be provided for all incoming students. And, you know, on the surface, it looks like a neutral public policy, health perspective, policy and so forth. But again, a big differentiator when it comes to economic background, because if you're the son or daughter of that middle-income family, you don't give that request a second thought, right? You just hand the request to mom or dad, and a few days later, they'll send in your immunization records, and you're good to go. If you're being raised by grandma and you had spotty health care and bounced around from high schools and so forth, you don't have those records. You know your grandma that doesn't have those records. And again, you say, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to college. So what we did for the summer of 16, the next cycle, is just change the onboarding process for all of our incoming students. For one thing, we added a new survey, a smartphone survey. Now, as soon as students get admitted to Georgia State, we send them a follow-up survey that asks all the kind of questions you'd never ask in a college application. Are you working? How many hours? Do you contribute to the finances of your family every month? Do you have a disability? What class in high school did you love? What class in high school did you hate? The idea is we want to develop a personalized communication flow with the students from the moment they're first admitted to Georgia State. Secondly, we built out a new portal This portal takes the students through those 14 bureaucratic steps I was describing a minute ago, but because it's a portal, we can track where they are in the process. So it used to be we knew a student was engaged, and now we're no longer hearing from them. They're not engaged any longer. Now we know a student was engaged up until the point where we asked them for their immunization records, and we can reach out with much more specific help. Do you know our health clinic offers the immunizations on, in afternoons after 3 o'clock and so forth? The third thing we did, which has gotten us the most attention and probably was the most impactful of these three things, is we became the first post-secondary institution in the nation to use an AI-enhanced chatbot for student success purposes. So what we did is we built out a knowledge base of over 2,000 answers to questions commonly asked by incoming freshmen. Questions about registration and financial aid and verification requests and immunization records and all these sorts of things. And we partnered with a startup out of the Harvard incubator, a company called AdmitHub, to put these responses on a smartphone platform. It's not an app, it's part of the texting function that students use. They just begin a conversation with Pounce. Pounce is our school mascot. And they can text 24/7 any question. What the AI does, the AI doesn't answer the question. The AI is used to take the question that is posed by the student and locate the right response in this knowledge base of 2,000 answers that we've already written and vetted and so forth. And if the answer is there, it's pulled out immediately and the student has their reply. Now, we did some estimates. We actually did an independent evaluation of this pilot when we ran it in the summer of 16, and we did some estimates leading up to it that maybe we'd have 5,000 to 6,000 questions answered in the 3 months leading up to the start of fall classes for our incoming freshmen. In those 3 months, just for our incoming freshman class, we had over 200,000 questions answered. The average response time was 7 seconds. Okay? What we found was really interesting, that in the qualitative evaluation that we did of the pilot, focus groups and discussions with students, there was a significant number of students who admitted that they asked the chatbot questions that they would have never asked a human being. If you can't get your biological father to sign the FAFSA because you haven't seen your biological father for 3 years, you don't necessarily want to go into some stranger's office, sit down, and spill out your personal history to that person. And what the students told us is they preferred the chatbot. They were more comfortable with the chatbot because they saw it as a tool that was designed to help them solve the problem rather than laying their problem at the foot of somebody else who would have to solve it for them. And did it make a difference from a quantitative perspective? It did. In 1 year, with just these interventions, which were actually quite low cost, and implemented all over the course of about 3 months, we reduced summer melt by 22%. Given the size of our incoming freshman class, that's about 300 additional students, mostly first generation, mostly low income, who were in their seats ready to go fall of 16, who were sitting out college entirely just 12 months earlier. Another example of things we found in our data, getting students off to a good start. We began to analyze, kind of reverse engineer the students who struggled at Georgia State. We would look at their freshman grades and then go back and say, well, what did they look like in high school? And here I'm not talking about looking at any demographic details or their race, ethnicity, or income level. What we began to do is look at high school grades. What does it mean if a student gets a B in 10th grade math from this particular high school when they take college algebra in freshman year when they come to Georgia State? And how does that B grade at this high school compared with how the student would perform if they got a B grade from this other high school? We got much better at predicting which students would in effect come to Georgia State and struggle. And many institutions would use that data to say, okay, now we know who we're not going to admit. But I've already explained that that was not what we were about at all. And so what we began thinking about is, how can we support these students better? There was a subset, it was about 10% of our admissible freshman class every year who only had a retention rate after 1 year of about 50%. So half the students would be gone in 12 months with debt and nothing to show for it. And so we started a different onboarding process for these students, a different admissions process. They now get a different admissions letter from the rest of the freshman class. It says, welcome to Georgia State for the fall. One condition, you have to come for the summer beforehand. It's not a remedial bridge program. It's not, let's get the students to do high school work. What we're doing intentionally is taking these students, put them in summer college-level classes. We do have a summer session for all of our students who want to enroll during the summer. We intentionally mix these students in with sophomores and juniors. So a lot of summer bridge programs are built. You take all the weakest students and put them together in a group, and hopefully they get stronger by the end of the program. We have never subscribed to that model at Georgia State. What you'll see again and again we're doing at Georgia State is taking weaker students academically and putting them around students who have already figured out how to do college, and letting the students do a lot of the mentoring and a lot of the leadership. And so we intentionally mix these students in with other students who have already gotten through at least a year or two of college. Because our enrollment's lower, we have more advising. They're all in learning communities. I'll say more about that in a second and so forth. But just through this process, and they get 7 credit hours towards their bachelor's degree by coming and become part of this whole summer session. Just by this relatively light touch intervention, and I meant to show you that. That's the letter that the students receive announcing that they're going to be admitted into this program, and those are some of the programmatic aspects of what they experience during the summer. Just through this relatively light touch intervention and 7 weeks of experience before the rest of the freshmen arrive, we've had huge changes in outcomes. Students who had the same academic profile, so the same SATs and high school grades, including high school grades in particularly important classes like English and math, that we were retaining after 1 year at a 50% clip, we're now retaining at an 87% clip. In fact, we're not only retaining them after 1 year at an 87% clip, we're graduating these students now at above a 60% clip. Students who, again, in the past. Now, that's a very low number compared to graduation rates at a place like Duke. But for this student population that are borderline getting into college, and a few years ago were only lasting at a 50% rate through 1 year of college, a group that is underserved, from underserved backgrounds for the most part, that's a huge victory, and we're talking about hundreds of additional students getting through. Another problem we identified: how we help or don't students get through the academic choices that we face them with. We overwhelm students with choices, and this is a discernible difference in my experiences from being at places like Duke and Princeton to being at a place like Georgia State. With the big state bureaucracy and which the huge number of students and departments and faculty we have, we overwhelm students with choices. We have about 150 undergraduate majors at Georgia State. This fall alone, we had over 4,000 undergraduate classes. And what we did historically at Georgia State is bring the students into an orientation room much like this, a lecture hall of 200 students at a time, and tell them to pick. Pick a major, pick 5 or 6 classes for your first fall semester. It'll all work out. Well, we ran the data. They made the picks, but it didn't all work out. 6-7 years ago at Georgia State, the average graduate of Georgia State was going through 2.6 majors before they graduated. Now, that might be nice if you just think about it as the ability to go and do some shopping around and so forth. But if you enroll 60% of your students as low income, that's a disaster. Low-income students can't afford to go through 2.5 majors before they graduate. Every time they switch, they're creating added time to degree, wasted credit hours, added debt load, and a subset are dropping out, either because they lose interest or because they run out of financial aid and resources to sustain them. And so what we've done at Georgia State is change the way we onboard our students academically. We build up another portal. This one takes whatever area of interest the student put on their application. In this example, it's a nursing student, said they're interested in nursing. Shows them live job data for the metro Atlanta area for how many jobs are listed for nurses, what's the starting salary if you have a bachelor's degree, what's the starting salary if you have an associate's degree, what's the average time to degree and cost of that degree at Georgia State. And like Netflix and Amazon that say, well, you like these books or movies, you might be interested in these other things. We say, well, if you're interested in nursing, you may be interested in the fact that we have degrees in health management and health informatics, a degree in radiologic technology. I didn't know till I looked at this portal that there are as many jobs every morning in metro Atlanta for radiologic technicians as there are for nurses, and the starting salaries are comparable. So if I don't know that, what 17, 18-year-old coming into Georgia State is going to know this? The students have this portal available to them throughout their academic career, but we push them to it in that summer before they come to class and before they come to orientation to register for classes. Then we started registering all our first semester students into learning communities. For us, learning communities are groups of 25 students that travel in all their classes together. A big barrier for especially first generation students in succeeding in college, surviving in college, is many come to these big campuses where everybody seems to know more about how higher education works, seems to be richer, seems to be smarter, seems to be better prepared, and they feel out of place. And at a big school like Georgia State, you could easily be a first semester student, take 5 or 6 classes, and never see the same face twice. And so we social engineer this in a sense by registering students in groups of 25 students. They take all their classes together. Now, at Georgia State, we can't afford to cap all our classes at 25 enrollment, so in some cases they might be in a lecture hall this big. But they still know 24 other students in that class, so they can have study partnerships and friendships, and if they miss the class, they know who to get the notes from, and so forth. Building up a sense of community just from the registration structure has helped improve freshman year GPA and also improve the retention rate for those students. But what we started doing 5 years ago to deal with the problem of students bouncing between majors is setting up all of those learning communities around so-called meta majors. We no longer put any pressure on incoming students to pick among the 150 majors that we offer. What we do is try to identify a general area of interest. We find 24 other students who share that same area of interest so that they can not only learn and study together, but talk about their interest in STEM or business or foreign language or whatever their interest is. And then we push programming at them all through the first year. Because they're registered around their areas of interest, we can have faculty members from the meta major area teach the orientation class. We can do open houses in the departments, alumni panels. So the students get to, if you're interested in business, you get to learn the difference between marketing and finance and risk management and so forth. And so by the end of the first year, you actually have some substantive context for making an informed decision about what you're majoring in, rather than what we were foisting upon students in the past. And so has this made a difference? Well, it made a big difference. 3 years after we began bringing all of our first semester students in to Georgia State and learning communities based on meta majors, we had over a 30% drop in the number of students changing majors after the sophomore year. Now that's not, real exciting data that I'd share with a state legislature, but when we're talking about equity and talk about how you eliminate equity and achievement gaps, this is part of the picture. You've got to get students into the right fit so that your program is not really a 5.5 or 6 year programs when the students are only funded for 4 years, because that means the upper income students will continue to get their degrees, the lower income students will drop out before they complete their program. Getting students through tough gateway courses, these freshman and sophomore year classes that supposedly weed out the weak students. 7 years ago at Georgia State, 43% of the students across the entire academic year, 43% of the students who took introductory math got non-passing grades. You can't succeed with 43% of the students taking a required course and not passing it. And so we've totally changed the way we do introductory math at Georgia State. There's not a single section, a single seat of lecture hall math at Georgia State any longer. We build out these so-called emporiums, these labs. Students come as a group, as a class. Their instructors are in the room. They're all working at terminals on adaptive learning exercises. So everybody in this particular class may be doing chapter 3 of pre-calculus, but the slower students are getting more basic questions from the adaptive program till they build up basic competencies, so the course doesn't whiz by, leaving them in the dust. The more advanced students are getting more challenging questions so they don't tune out. Every hour that a student's in one of these labs, they're getting about 100 bits of immediate feedback. So they're doing math and hearing immediate feedback back again. In the old model, the math-phobic student would be back up there in the last row, slouched down, and hopefully, praying that they never get called on all semester long. And now for 3 hours a week, the students are actively doing math. Does it make a difference? You can see the numbers up there. And we're not where we want to be yet, but with the same material. In fact, we ran RCT, random control trials the first semesters where we had the students in the lecture hall sections and the emporium sections come together and take the exact same midterm and final. And we found the students did much better on the same material with the same learning outcome, the bar set equally high in these adaptive sections. And I'm going to show you in a minute, they not only do better in the immediate math course, they do better in next level math and science classes that these courses help build the foundations for. Because it's worked well in math, we now have an initiative from our social science faculty. This is purely coming from the faculty. They're converting about 15,000 seats of social science courses in psychology, economics, and political science to adaptive hybrid classes in order to lower the non-pass rates. And for the classes not going through the pedagogical changes, we have one of the largest peer mentoring programs in the country. So what we do is we use data to identify the courses with the highest non-pass rates at the freshman and sophomore level. Then we use data to look at our work study and other supported students for students who have aced those same classes. You know, if you have a sophomore who got an A in organic chemistry, don't have them working on campus answering phones at some front desk. You know, use that talent in order to get them to help other students. So that's what we do. We pay them to go through training. We pay them to sit in every single session. They're getting paid by the hour to sit in the same class they already succeeded in with, so they get to be integrated with the new students and get to know what's going on. And we pay them to do instructional sessions 3 times a week. Every time that a student comes into one of these tutoring sessions, we just have them swipe their ID, their campus ID, so we get all the demographic data. We've seen lots of interesting things there. You see some on the board. The students do a lot better, about half a letter grade better than their peers if they attend at least 5 of these sessions. But maybe the most interesting thing is we've seen an inverse correlation between the students showing up for faculty office hours and the students showing up for supplemental instruction. You know, we have to appreciate there are social barriers to a first-generation student knocking on a faculty member's door and saying, I don't understand what you're saying. You have to explain it to me in a better way. And a lot of the students won't do that, and they won't get help. And some of those students who are least likely to get help in that so-called more traditional fashion are now the biggest users and the beneficiaries of this supplemental instruction program. Students who stop out at places like Georgia State and nationally, a student who stops out for a single semester reduces their chances of ever graduating by 20, 30 percentage points. Nationally, if a student stops out involuntarily for even a single semester, they only have about a 30% chance of ever coming back and completing their degree. And we had a huge problem with this at Georgia State, in fact, a growing problem for ironic reasons. As we began to raise our retention rate, and with all the low-income students we enroll, we began to have more and more students dropping out for financial reasons. So back again now, 7, 8 years ago, we were dropping 1,000 students a semester, not because they weren't academically qualified, but because they couldn't cover the full cost of their tuition and fees. They just didn't have the money. So we did an analysis. It was overwhelming looking at 1,000 students, and we didn't have scholarship resources to bestow on these students. But we did an analysis, and we found some interesting things. The biggest subset of the students we were dropping every semester for non-payment were seniors. Why seniors? Because they were the ones running out of eligibility for their aid, right? Scholarships, and I'm sure it's true at Duke as well, most scholarships are 4 years. You know, you go 1 semester past that 4-year mark, you go from 100 to 0, right, as far as what that scholarship is covering. And that was just the same for our students, except they didn't have any alternate means. It wasn't like, oh, now I go to mom and dad and ask for that, you know, $6,000, $7,000 I need for that last semester or 2 and so forth. The other thing we found is that a lot of these students didn't have particularly high balances. We were dropping students. Students were stopping out at Georgia State for $300. And, you know, some people are surprised by that, but when you're low income and when you have exhausted all your loan eligibility, you don't have a circle of friends and relatives who are there with $300 to provide you with. And so this, you know, so this was the germ for a program that was considered radical at the time, back in 2011 when we launched it. Now is being replicated nationally, what we call Panther retention grants. The students have to do nothing. We're good at data. We don't need a student to come in and self-identify and say they need help and sign some form. We just look at the roster of students who we're going to drop, because we're the ones who do it, right, for non-payment. And before we do so, we do run some analytics. Is the student plugging away? This is not a scholarship program. You can have a 4.0 GPA, you can have a 2.0 GPA and be equally qualified as long as you're plugging away and taking the right classes. Are they close to graduation? If you're a senior, you're going to get one of these grants. And do you owe a balance below $1,500? What we started to do is just put the money in the student's account. We call them up, let them know we've done so. Don't make plans Monday morning because, you know, you're good to go for the semester. The first couple semesters, we had multiple students hanging up on us. They thought it was a scam. Nobody from Georgia State just put $900, $1,200 into my account. But we found this to be a highly effective and impactful program. The students who get these grants, you can see the numbers there. 87% of them are graduating within 2 semesters, as opposed to the national average, which is 30% of these students eventually graduating if they had actually stopped out. And because the program has been so impactful, we've scaled it up big. We've given over 11,000 of these grants over the last 5 years This past year, over 1,300 of the students who crossed the stage with bachelor's degrees were recipients of one of these grants. And there's been some interest in this program. As I say, there are two pilots being run by philanthropic groups now at other institutions to pilot this program. But the Gates Foundation came in and said, well, it's so impactful. Why aren't other campuses doing it? What is the cost? What is the ROI? So they had Boston Consulting Group come and spend 6 weeks at Georgia State last fall looking at all our data from 5 years of the program. Boston Consulting Group came away with the conclusion this program generates 35% more revenues for the university than it costs. We give the students $900 on average. We immediately get back $900 because it's just covering the money they owe us, right? But the average student who gets a $900 grant actually has a university bill of $2,800. So we not only recover the $900 immediately, but we're holding on to that additional whatever, $1,900 that they've already paid out of pocket and loans and so forth. So here's a rare instance of doing the right thing is actually doing the prudent thing. And I do firmly believe that this type of approach is going to be more and more the norm in the years ahead. Last program I'm going to talk about, but maybe the one that we've been most noted for, is how you keep students on track academically. So just like is true with the students dropping out for financial reasons, we were losing hundreds, many hundreds of students, 700, 800 students a semester for academic reasons. And sometimes the outsiders don't understand this. They think that dropping out of college is kind of like declaring bankruptcy, that you have to go someplace and sign something and do it. But we all know what happens. In a place like Georgia State, it really happens in this way. A student is enrolled one semester, and then they just don't register for the next semester. And you may send them an email or call them, a faculty member knows them, and then they don't register for the next and the next. And they just become dropouts, right? It doesn't happen in any dramatic fashion. So we asked the simple question back in 2010 and 11, what would a system look like where we identified who was dropping out of Georgia State, not 6 months, 12 months after the fact, which was the norm then. We'd figure it out after it had already happened, but 6 months, 12 months, 24 months before it happened. What are the early warning signs, the indicators that a student is going to drop out? So we engaged in a big data project. We used 10 years of data, 2.5 million Georgia State grades, 140,000 student records. The goal was really simple. We were trying to find any identifiable behaviors that correlated in a statistically significant way to students dropping and flunking out of the university. Our hypothesis was that we were going to find maybe a few dozen. We actually found 800 different behaviors that correlated in a statistically significant way to dropping out. And what we've been doing for over 6 years now at Georgia State is tracking every single Georgia State student every single night for every one of those 800 risk factors. What we do is as we update every evening all of our electronic records, our tracking, our registration records, the grading, all those sorts of things, is we're just looking for any of these behaviors. If one is identified, then the very next morning, the staff person, the academic advisor assigned to that student gets an alert, and they have 48 hours for an intervention. So what kind of things are we tracking? A lot of it's just common sense sort of things. These program maps, I bet you have those here as well. This is the map students need to complete to get a BS in chemistry. We've been handing these to students for a generation. They get a sheet of paper, they can go on the website and read it. We've never been tracking where students were in actually following the map. What we've found every year, there have been about 3,000 instances where students have signed up for courses that wouldn't have gotten them any closer to graduation. They just didn't apply to their degree program at all. In the past, those 3,000 students would have paid for and taken those classes and be told about the problem after the fact. Now we're letting the students know before the first day of classes begin. The students can still choose to stay in the wrong class. We don't have the ability to force them. But like 95% of the students are saying, oh, I didn't realize that, and switching to a class that's more appropriate. And what about the students who fall off path, which is the majority of our students? So these maps are great if you take every course in sequence and get the minimum grade you need in each course. But what if, rather than getting the minimum grade of B-, you get a C- in that prerequisite course? And now all your other classmates are in some other level course. What are you going to do? And we've never really paused to help that student. So now we're tracking all these registration records for every student and intervening to make sure the students are on path and taking the right classes. The predictive analytics look like this. Again, common sense delivered at scale. What we found is that there is a strong correlation across Georgia State between the first grade a student gets in his or her major and their chances of graduating on time. We've run this for every major at Georgia State, so this is just a sampling. But if you look at political science in the middle of the screen, if you're a political science major, get an A or B in your first political science class at Georgia State, you're graduating on time at over a 75% clip on average. That's great for us. You get a C in that first class, you're graduating on time at a 25% clip. What, though, historically had we done with that C student? You know, nothing. You just pass them on to upper-level coursework. You met the prerequisite. Now you can go on and take upper-level political science. But which of us would say with a straight face to a student, you're ready to take upper-level coursework, and oh, by the way, you have a 25% chance of succeeding? So now we have the intervention before the student takes those upper-level classes, pays for them, and begins to collect D's and F's. We sit down with the student, we look at the papers and exams, maybe they have reading or writing issues, maybe it's just they're working 40 hours a week, but let's figure out what the problem is now, rather than when the student digs himself or herself into a deeper hole. We label this whole platform for our students GPS advising because we want students to think about it, and we think about it like the GPS in your car. You know, you're driving without GPS and make a wrong turn, it's often very difficult to find your way back onto the right path again, right? If you don't realize it for 10 or 15 or 30 minutes, it can be a long and arduous path back again. But now with GPS, you're beginning to make the wrong turn before you even get through that intersection. It's already being recalibrated. Well, that's the same thing with our advising platform. We can't prevent at times from mistakes happening, students underperform in a class, get a grade that's below the prerequisite level and so forth. But we sure as heck can do our part in getting the student back on path as soon as possible. The trick here is doing this at scale. Over the last 12 months alone, we've had over 55,000 one-on-one meetings with Georgia State students that were prompted by alerts coming out of this platform. We didn't correct 55,000 problems, but I can say 6 years ago, before we launched this initiative, these were 55,000 issues that were going completely undiagnosed, right? Students were signing up for the wrong classes, they were underperforming in prerequisites, nobody was lifting a finger. We were expecting our student body, which for us mostly low-income first generation, to have diagnostic powers that we were unwilling to assume for ourselves. Now we're finally giving the students a fighting chance. And does it make a difference? It makes a big difference. We launched in summer of 2012. By the next semester, we saw a significant increase in retention progression rates, especially for underserved students. So it wasn't so much a leap for the first-time full-time freshmen, but the part-time students, the transfer students, the adult learners, the military learners, they're the ones that have benefited the most for being tracked for these 800 different risk factors on a day-to-day basis. And we've seen a significant drop since this initiative was launched in average time to degree. We haven't lowered or reduced any graduation requirements, but the average Georgia State student is taking over half a semester less time now to complete their bachelor's degree than they were just 5 years ago. They're finding the right major earlier on, they're taking math once rather than 2 or 3 times, they're registered for the right classes and progressing more efficiently. And if you think that savings in time to degree doesn't translate into much, that's about $18 million in savings in tuition and fees for this year's graduating class alone compared to the graduating class the year before we launched the initiative. And here's maybe the most surprising result of our use of predictive analytics in advising. When we launched the platform, the one criticism, and it was pretty biting that I heard from some faculty member as we talked about what we plan to do is, oh, I see what you're doing. You're creating a system for moving students to easier majors. The premise was if we use probabilities and predictions to advise students, they'll all end up in the easiest degree programs and taking the easiest courses. Well, we're now 6 years into this initiative. We've had over 250,000 one-on-one meetings with students based on the analytics. Our 2 fastest growing majors, biology, computer science. Nobody at Georgia State thinks those are among our easiest majors. Every year since we've had this platform in place, we've set new records for the number of underserved students completing STEM degrees. Here you see the increase in a 5-year period on the number of STEM degrees we're conferring to each of the populations in the red. The blue is the change in enrollment over that time period. I just wanted to show this isn't because we're enrolling so many more students. The other thing it's not due to is there hasn't been a large increase in the number of students coming in and declaring STEM majors. When we looked at the data, what has happened is a big reduction in the number of students who do declare STEM majors and then wipe out after a semester or 2. we used to be perfectly happy to bring that first-generation low-income student in and say, oh yeah, you want to sign up for pre-med biochemistry, go right to it. And we'd sit idly back as they struggled in calculus and struggled in orgo and so forth. And a couple semesters later, we were sitting there, if they were still enrolled at all, saying, sorry, you're going to have to switch your major because you flunked all the required courses. Now, students are getting alerts as early as 3 weeks into the semester, long before the midterm. Midterm grades that in the past might have been a D, might be a B minus, and by the final, hopefully that pulls up to a B plus. And then they have the requisite skills to then succeed in the courses the next semester. So in conclusion, let me talk about the aggregate impacts. I've kind of walked you through from the time we first encounter the student prior to registration all the way to getting them to the tail end of the degree program. What happens when you put all of these pieces together? Well, one thing that has changed is Georgia State's identity, its self-identity and its perception from outside. You may recognize who that gentleman is on the far right there. This was last fall. We did not invite Bill Gates to come and visit us. Bill Gates invited himself. No kidding. It's true. He was speaking downtown Atlanta, giving a keynote. And a couple weeks before, his people contacted us and said, you know, Bill's going to be in town, and he's read a lot about what you're doing for low-income students with data and technology. Would you mind if he came by for a couple hours to talk about it? We said, no, that would not. No, of course we said that'd be great. But he did, it wasn't a ceremonial visit. He didn't meet the president and any of that sort of thing. He spent 3 hours on campus talking to me, one of my team members, and 4 students. And he was fascinated by all of this. You know, that's really good for the identity of a campus that has been overshadowed by the Georgia Techs and UGAs and Emorys and so forth, to begin to have a perception of something that we do that gets national attention. You heard in the introduction, I had the honor of speaking twice at the White House. President Obama cited our programs. Been a little quieter over the last 20 months or so. I'm not sure if there's something has changed or not, but we've heard less from the White House recently. But that's been good for Georgia State. This has also been good. You know, for institutions like Georgia State, one of the best ways to combat declining state appropriations is just to do our job, do it well, support students. Every 1% we improve our retention rate at Georgia State, it's worth about $3 million annually in tuition and fees. So you pull in these revenues from students who in the past were going to leave the institution and walk away. But we haven't improved our success numbers by 1%. They're actually up by 23 percentage points. So we're talking about sizable revenues that have been brought in. Of course, it's neither for Bill Gates' attention or the revenues that we launched these programs. This is the reason we've launched. Despite all those demographic trends that would tell the pundits that our graduation rates and success rates should be going down, over these last 6 years, we're up 67% in our degrees conferred. But look at this detail. Look at where the degrees have come from. The biggest gains, over 100% increase for our underserved populations. We're up over 100% in bachelor's degrees for African American students, almost 30% for our low income, 160% for our Hispanic students. Note here, and this is not uncontroversial, but it's important to underline, that I haven't once this afternoon mentioned the African American male this, the low income student program over here. What we've done in order to make these kind of transformative changes is change the institution for all students. It's all the students who come in with the chatbot and in learning communities and in adaptive learning math and get tracked for 800 risk factors. It's not any subset of the students. But as we began to remove the bureaucratic obstacles that we ourselves had constructed, the students who have benefited the most are the students who struggled the most under the insane bureaucracy we had in the past. And those graduation rates we started with a few minutes ago, the blue bar is where we were 15 years ago. It's not that the graduation rates have improved incrementally. They've literally improved exponentially. We've more than doubled our graduation rates for black students. We've almost tripled it for our Latino Hispanic students. We've more than tripled it for African American male students. And each of the last 3 years, and Georgia State is the only public university in the United States that can claim this, each of the last 3 years, our black, our Hispanic, our first generation, and our Pell, our low-income students, have all graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. So there's no equity gap at Georgia State based on race, ethnicity, or income level. And, you know, last data point for you this afternoon, this institution in the shadow of the Martin Luther King district that was segregated into the 1960s, and as recently as a decade ago was grossly underserving its students of color, now is conferring more bachelor's degrees to African Americans than any other college or university in the United States. So as I conclude, and then we'll open it up for some conversation, let me put a kind of more personal footnote to this, because it is nice to talk about the data, but behind each one of these data points are some real lives. You know, when we had Bill Gates coming to visit us, the request was he wanted to meet with students. And so what we did is we found 4 students for him to meet with, all of them first generation, all of whom had benefited from one of the programs I've been describing this afternoon. And from just looking at that picture, you may not guess which of these students almost surely had the least likelihood to make it into the room that day. But it was almost surely that, you know, red-headed young man on the far right. That's Austin Burchell. Austin Burchell is from Northwest Georgia, first-generation student, came from a very low-income family. His father was career military, and then when he left the military, he ran a fruit and vegetable stand. And so already the chances of Austin ever making it to college are marginal. But the odds were stacked against him much more than that. When he's in middle school, his father is diagnosed with ALS, and it starts a multi-year period where Austin, he's the oldest child in the household, has to come home from school directly after school every day, no extracurriculars, because he had to relieve his mother. His mother was watching the dad during the day, and he would come home, and his mother would then go to a retail job into the evening. And, you know, he does this for several years. Sadly, when he's 14 years old in high school, his father succumbs to ALS. And he talks about a pivotal moment for him. He came home one day from school, and his mother was at the kitchen table with her resumes spewed out across the table, and, you know, distraught, tearful. And she says, you know, she'd lost her job in the last part of the father's illness because it was so all-consuming. And she says to Austin, you know, I can't get into the job market. I can't even get a retail job because everybody who's getting a job has a college degree. And so this exceptional young man, despite all the obstacles and odds against him, makes this silent vow to himself, you know, I'm not going to let this happen to me. I'm going to study real hard. I'm going to work. I'm going to get good grades. I'm going to get a scholarship, and I'm going to go to college. And amazingly, he does so. He turns his grades around. He gets really good SAT scores. He finishes his senior year in high school winning something in Georgia called the Zellmiller Scholarship. It's the most prestigious state scholarship in the state of Georgia. Only goes to the top 3 to 4% of high school seniors. He's scouting colleges. He doesn't have a car. He takes the bus to go to downtown Atlanta, visits Georgia State, loves it, thinks that this is the perfect place for him, gets admitted to Georgia State. Everything is working out in his favor until he gets his first bill in the summer. In July, he gets his first bill, opens it up, and it's about $5,000 more than he thought it would be. And like a lot of first-generation students, his first reaction is to blame himself. You know, what an idiot. I thought I had figured it all out, and I obviously miscalculated. At first, he's even embarrassed to tell his mother because he knows how crestfallen she's going to be because they don't have the $5,000 to pay out of pocket. But because Austin is industrious, and because this was the summer of 16 and not the summer of 15, we had the chatbot available. And Austin begins 2 nights in which he uses the chatbot 40 times. That's the only reason we knew any of this story, or we found out any of this story. When we picked him to meet with Bill Gates, we just picked him out because he had been somebody who used the chatbot a lot. And we only heard the story as part of the visit and in the aftermath. And, you know, he gets on the chatbot and he starts asking questions about what my bill should be and when these payments should come in and so forth. Over 2 nights, he figures out that on some state document, his Social Security number had been transposed by 2 digits. And this big Zellmiller scholarship he was supposed to be awarded hadn't been applied to his account. He talks about the fact he was so relieved, and his mother was so relieved on hearing this, that they take another bus to downtown Atlanta. 99% of our students pay online. They're not going to put this to any chance. They come physically to the cashier's office. You know, there's still a balance of like $240 or something, and they pay that in person and get the receipt. And Austin says, you know, while he's standing there in line, his mother, you know, has tears streaming down her face. And my favorite moment of the Bill Gates visit was, of course, we had Austin be the one to show Bill Gates the chatbot and how to use it. And Bill Gates was fascinated by it. He spent 10 minutes, you know, putting questions in and so forth. But Austin, as he's sitting down with Bill Gates, says, I must say, sir, it's rather humbling to be teaching software to you. And as Bill Gates was getting ready to leave, the students got together for the requisite selfie. And, you know, we live in very divisive times. There's not a lot that unites us. But I will say that, one thing that I think we all can agree upon from whatever end of the political or any other spectrum is that the world would be a lot poorer place if that selfie had been taken and Austin hadn't been in the picture. And that's why these efforts are so important, because, Austin is one of initially hundreds and thousands and then tens of thousands of students who are doing everything right but being let down by us. We're the smart people, we're the adults in the room, we're supposed to have it figured out, and we throw all these confusing things at students and blame them when they don't navigate the system. So that's why I think these issues are so important, but that's also why I'm so hopeful about them, because some people think these demographic issues are destiny. They think that it starts in preschool and it starts in kindergarten and so forth, and a first generation or a low-income student or a student from an underrepresented minority is just destined to not be able to achieve and succeed at the same level. And I think the power of Georgia State's example is that while all of these influences are important, they're not insurmountable, and that there are things within the power of everybody in this room, things that we can change to make sure that Austin and thousands of students like him who are doing everything right, actually get to, realize their dreams. So thanks so much for your attention. It's great being here, and I'm happy to answer questions and talk. So what do you think? Comments? Yes.
This is a finer point, but so going back to the Wayback Machine, you were talking about how you brought these kids onto campus over the summer and had them integrated with the general population. And then when the fall starts, you seem to take at least a significant overlap and cluster them into a much smaller community. And I'm just kind of wondering, A, why that decision was made to do it like that, and kind of B, whether you see any negative outflow of then, taking them away from that integrated experience and putting them all together.
We actually, that's a great question. We actually don't take them fully away from the summer integrated experience, but we want them to have some experiences within their academic field. So it is a mix of those things. What we do is we continue to try to get the summer academy students together throughout the academic year. They have a peer mentor who helps cluster them and pull them together. They keep discussion groups going. That peer mentor will host events to bring them together and so forth. But you're right, it's not absolutely perfect, but that again should be encouraging for all of us, because we can do even imperfect things that help the students immensely. One of the real nice things we saw once we began building these communities in the summer and then for all of the incoming students during the freshman year is that it helped overcome some demographic challenges of the past. We used to have issues of when students picked roommates, only about 20% of our students live on campus, but when they picked roommates, they tended to be very uniform with regard to race and ethnicity. So the black students roomed with black students, the white with white students, and so forth. We've seen a significant breakdown of that trend since we started the learning communities. Why? Because if you're with 24 other students for all of your classes, all semester long, and you're in study groups and so forth, you build up friendships and partnerships that cross all those racial and ethnic lines. And those then can be extended the next year and say, oh, who am I going to roommate? I'm going to room with this person. So I think I am encouraged by the fact that we can do a few things to bring students together and make them feel more supported. A lot of this at Georgia State comes out of necessity. I mean, the frank reality is we're not as well resourced as Duke, we're not as well resourced as Princeton and Dartmouth. And so how do you give students a more personalized supportive experience when we don't have the ability to just hire more faculty and more staff to lower faculty and staff ratios, to student ratios? And one way is to say, well, the students learn from each other. You all know that if you're in the classroom here at Duke, how much you learn from your classmates as opposed to just your instructors. Let's find ways for the students to learn from each other at Georgia State. And we had big disadvantages there as well, because as a largely commuter school, with 90% of our students working, what students tended to do in the past is they'd come in, take their classes, head right to the parking lot, and they were gone. And oftentimes it was by necessity. They had family obligations and jobs to get to and so forth. But now, if we can, in the academic experience, engineer a community, some of these students have a much more supportive environment. So that's a good question. Yes?
I work for Wake Tech Community College, and our student body is very similar in terms of first generation college students, commuter campus, all those things. And while we're always trying unique strategies, I think it's really interesting how you've taken this systems approach. So I'm curious, on the data side, what has the path been for selling leadership and faculty and staff around using data? How did you get it funded early on? And then also, how did you navigate all of the ed tech companies that are out there trying to get you into their products?
Yeah, those are great, really astute questions. Yeah, it was definitely a process, and it wasn't always moving forward. There were some setbacks along the way. Initially, we tried to be very thoughtful, and I think that's true to this day. When we launch something, we're not only launching it, and we are primarily launching it to benefit the students, but we're also thinking immediately about what are going to be the data and the other elements we need 6 months from now when somebody's standing in front of the faculty senate or some other skeptical group to say, this is why we're doing it and this is why it's working. When we launched the chatbot in the summer of 2016, I mentioned we had an independent evaluator. We actually hired Lindsay Page, who is the first person I recommended as the author of the Summer Melt book, because she was already known in this space. She's at the University of Pittsburgh to do an evaluation, to do, in effect, a random controlled trial, because we couldn't scale up across all the students that first semester. We just didn't have the resources to do so. So we did a controlled study of the students who had the chatbot versus those who didn't and compared the numbers and so forth. She's published, by the way, on that. If you want to read some of her research on the Georgia State experiment with chatbots, you can do so in the Journal of Social Science Research and in the Harvard Business Review. Both have published her studies on this. But that's really good if you're trying to convince the campus this is an important way to go, because you're going to get a lot of skepticism. But if you get Harvard Business Review publishing the results of and those results are positive, that can help sway attention. So that's one thing we've done quite intentionally is, as we've launched things, think a year down the road to what kind of arguments you'll need in order to make the claim further. We've also had a very progressive president and chief financial officer at Georgia State. Early on, I sat down with them and I worked out an agreement which basically says that if we move retention rates and produce the net increase in revenues that I was describing a moment ago, 10% of those revenues should come back to these offices so that we can invest further in these programs and so forth. They've been very happy with that arrangement, and we've been very happy as well. It has allowed us to grow immensely. Since we launched our use of predictive analytics in advising, we've hired 60 more advisors for the Atlanta campus, these people doing all the interventions and the trackings on the day-to-day basis, and that's largely because of this kind of model. But at big institutions like Georgia State, maybe at places like Duke as well, that kind of proactive, positive thinking about revenue and how to distribute and so forth is fairly uncommon. So, I think these kind of the attention will go to things like chatbots and so forth. That's what people want to talk about. But we also need to understand what kind of models will change higher education so that people will invest in what really is important for higher ed. And on the point of community college, what I didn't have a chance to talk about today, but I'll mention as a footnote, is I mentioned we're 34,000 students at the Atlanta campus, which I've been describing. We're 53,000 students across all our campuses. 2.5 years ago, we were consolidated with the largest community college in Georgia. It was a failing institution, graduation rates plummeting and quite low and so forth. And what the state said is, you're already working in the space with all these technologies and approaches, and then they made Perimeter College part of Georgia State. We've only had 2.5 years to work on this now, but the graduation rates at Perimeter College have almost tripled over this time period. So these same sorts of things, there's nothing magic about anything I described. If you hear the programs we're implementing, most people just nod their head, say, oh, sure, yeah, let a student know when they signed up for the wrong class. Give them an early warning. Help them if they need $500 that last semester to get. We're doing these common sense things. Yeah, they work at Georgia State at the Atlanta campus. Yeah, they work for the community college students as well. And that's completely open access. So these are students who are admitted as long as they have a GED or high school diploma, and they're thriving under these kind of interventions. Yes.
Three questions, two are really quick,
Okay.
and one very time. So the first question is, you mentioned your summer academy. Is there financial aid for the summer academy?
There is not, but I'm going to make that a strike. We didn't have the resources to run a program where we could pay for the students. So we have them take a minimum of 7 credit hours. They're college-level credits, which for those of you who know financial aid, means they qualify for their financial aid. So they get funded for that semester, not by some grant that Georgia State gives, but whatever means of financial aid they would usually have. And we have some students who have Pell Grants, and some students taking out loans and so forth. But I do think that it's a really good investment. And now we do orientation for the parents, because some of the parents are skeptical about their students spending the summer not working, but instead, and many of the students still do work, but spending a lot of their time in the classroom. But we show them the data, 62% of the students graduating as opposed to 50% of the students surviving 1 year in the past. And that's a really good financial investment.
The second question is, you showed us many platforms, with the exception of or most of the platforms that we saw demonstrating outcomes and kind of students navigating and so forth. Is that all EAB?
Yeah, and this would get back to your question, which I didn't fully answer, about the technology. We've been very willing to partner with third parties, even for-profit third parties, when they can deliver a service that we know we will either not be able to deliver or will take us many years to implement. So EAB is our biggest partner. EAB is our partner. We were their first real partner nationally. We helped them develop this product that they now have sold to 450 schools. We starting in 2010 and 11 with the predictive analytics, and they've worked with us on things like the portal that shows students the job data and so forth. That's EAB as well. But we work with other partners as well, AdmitHub. We work with another company out of Kansas City called AdAstra on classroom analytics. We didn't talk about that, but once we began advising students much more rigorously, we began to have a problem because we were advising students into seats that didn't exist, right? There weren't enough psychology 3,400 seats available. And so what we're now doing is using analytics in order to 6 months, 12 months before predict what the demand is going to be down the road so that we schedule the right number of classes and so forth. So we've got probably 5 or 6 technology partners. That's often complicated. They have different platforms. They often don't want to play together because they see that as undermining their profits. But I would say that a lot of the gains we've had now would probably not have happened if we hadn't been willing to kind of be bold in being first to use some of these technologies.
And the very last question is, could you just describe kind of the organizational landscape structurally of all these student success initiatives? Kind of what does that look like on an org chart? How do they work together? What are kind of the roles that you've seen in opportunities?
What Georgia State is known for nationally, and I think it's a deserved reputation, it's not uncontroversial, is for centralizing more than most schools do. So when we launched our advising initiative in 2011 and 12, we had very decentralized advising. We had about 7 or 8 different advising offices on campus, one at each college. They didn't speak or talk very much to one another. They had different record keeping. They had different training. They had different salary structures. In fact, they were hiring each, the different offices were picking each other off by offering somebody $2,000 more to, move across campus and so forth. And what we've moved to is a model. It isn't completely centralized, but we do have one centralized location where there are 70 advisors located who represent every field at Georgia State. So what we try to do is look at it from a student perspective. Yes, it's more comfortable for engineering or for a business to have their own advising center really close to them. But for the first couple of years, students are still figuring out what they're doing and bouncing around. Wouldn't it be better to have one place where the students could go and we're not bouncing them around across campus? And so we did that. The advisors still specialized in academic areas around especially meta-major fields, but they're co-located. They're all trained the same way. They're all using EAB. They're using the same note-keeping system. So if another advisor meets with a student who's not the usual advisor, they can immediately sign in and see what the student has been talking about with their main advisor and so forth. So we've done that repeatedly to the point now where I've got under me at Georgia State a very large division that includes admissions, financial aid, student accounts, advising, undergraduate studies, scholarship office, international student services, TRIO programs, career services. I probably left out 1 or 2. But the idea, and it came bit by bit over the last 10 years, is every time we had a hiccup that was based on our own bureaucracy getting in the way, we thought about what would this look like that would be, from a student perspective, a more manageable system. It's been really good timing for us to be centralized because we didn't fully anticipate 10 years ago how much more important technology would be. But when you think about the benefits of technology and how difficult it is to gain those benefits if, for instance, you have 7 different advising offices, each which are acting autonomously, and one says, we like EAB, and the other says, no, we like our current system, and the other says, no, we like another vendor out there, Starfish or Civitas, which is exactly the direction we were heading in as we began some of these efforts. It's really helped. We have one CRM, a customer management system, across all of our offices. So if a student comes in with a problem in admissions or in financial aid, people in other offices see the same ticket, and so they know here's what's happened and so forth. So we have moved more in that direction than probably any other institution our size. I give the credit to our president. Oftentimes those decisions are very difficult and unpopular on campus. Academic units sometimes feel that this is a loss of autonomy or loss of some of their power. The irony when it comes to advising, and I know we have some advising people in the room, is the deans may sometimes say that, but there are and I travel a lot, visit lots and lots of campuses, hundreds of campuses. There are very few deans who really take pride in knowing a lot about advising. So if you're a dean, where does advising rank in your priorities? You have faculty to deal with, and fundraising, and donors, and research, and all these other things. And way down there at the bottom of the list somewhere is your advising office. And what we've done at Georgia State is not only centralize, but actually bring people in whose main specialty is advising, and they're the ones who are leading the conversation and the implementation of what we do. So I think it's been really, very beneficial to the students, and it is frustrating that at so many places, and this was absolutely true of Georgia State a few years ago, students just get lost between the cracks again and again. One of the things that prompted us to do the centralization of advising is we had a referral system. We were told, oh yeah, it's true, we're 6 different locations, 7 different locations across campus, and we don't coordinate training or note keeping, but we have a referral system where if a student comes into business but they need to talk to somebody in sociology, we write out a form, a ticket, and then they take it over to that other office. We did some tracking and found that only about 50% of the referrals were ever realized in the next. So here's real students coming into a real office seeking real help, and only 50% of them are getting help. Well, you talk about the origins of the equity gaps. That's where those equity gaps begin. Let's go ahead.
It seems like, for just a comment and then a question, that the title of this talk is something to do with using analytics, but it's actually more like using anthropology and kind of a deeply empathetic approach to your customer, which I think is really interesting, and a lot of things that we could learn from here at Duke. The question, because I work in alumni affairs, is have you seen a change in your alumni community and their engagement with the university as a result of implementing these changes? And if so, what has that looked like? And do you take the same approach, the same analytics-driven approach to your alumni engagement? And kind of what's your view on that?
Yeah, all these changes are fairly recent, so we're not going to be able to track, the grads from 15 years ago and so forth. But I will say 2 things. One, we do exit surveys of all our graduating seniors, and we've seen significant changes in answers to questions like, I felt that the university cared about me or was concerned about my well-being and so forth. Those have gotten much more positive. And 2, we have seen with some particular programs already significant changes in the way the alums are interacting with the university. The clearest example of that is the Panther retention grants. Imagine that you're a low-income student, you're facing getting dropped from all your classes and having to stop out and take up a job and so forth instead, and the university swoops in and just gives you the money. And it does that over and over again 11,000 times. That's going to begin to change the relationship students have. And even though these graduates can't be more than 5 years out, because the program has only existed 6 years, can't be more than 5 years out, we've already begun to see some of these alums saying, well, I want to give back and I want to support that kind of program because it made such a difference to me. So I do think, I have gone through some of these design thinking workshops. I was out at Stanford for doing some of those things. I do think that there's benefit to that. I was talking earlier with some of your colleagues about behavioral economics as well. I'm a fan of reading all the theories of behavioral economics, because what they've shown again and again is there's simple things we can do that significantly change student behavior. And people's behavior more broadly, but students more particularly. And a lot of what we're doing is just in that sort. There's almost no policy that we've created that mandates that the student behave differently. In fact, I can't think of a single example of that. What we've done in the behavioral economics terminology is nudge students in different ways, give them a different set of options. You know, the idea of the meta majors came directly from some of those behavioral economics studies. You probably heard about some of these. The experiment where they had 25 different jams for sale in a supermarket and let people sample, and they didn't sell any because people were just overwhelmed by 25 choices, and then they had a choice of 3 and people sampled the 3, and then they bought one of them at a much higher level. Well, we moved from 150 majors down to, you know, the 8 meta majors with that same theory in mind. Let's make the choice a simple one to start with, and the students will be much more comfortable making an informed choice there, and then we'll build from that. Yes, you were going to.
One of the challenges that we had in Chapel Hill is after a student does leave, whatever we might have done to retain them before then, we have a number of hoops that they have to jump through. You're 14 to start at the first year. I think we're seeing that on the readmission side. Have you integrated any of what you've done for the readmission?
Absolutely, that's a great question too. And I'll say, for those students trying to re-enroll, often there are additional hoops added, because oftentimes the reason they left is there's some kind of academic issue, there's some hold on their account, there's some behavioral or disciplinary issue, and you have to get them through that as well. For a lot of our students, there are financial barriers, and if they've been gone for a while, they're often in collections now. So it's not just they have to pay us off, but they have to pay some collection agency off to dig themselves out. So what we've done, and it's not a panacea, it's not a magical solution, but we have developed what we call triage teams. Teams that have members from admissions, financial aid, the advising office, and the registrar's office who meet together to look at any one of the cases. We proactively now reach out to the students. We're running data to look at good candidates for coming back to the university. If somebody's, is $25,000 in debt and in collections, it's hard for us to then proactively reach out to them, and then the next line is, no, we don't have $25,000 for you. And so we look for students who are good candidates, and then we have that triage team do an analysis before the first outreach so that we can present the students with a plan. So it's not just, we'd really love for you to come back, good luck figuring out how, but it's, here's the couple things you need to do. And we have control to streamline a lot of these things. I mean, holds are killers. I don't know how many holds are on your campuses, but there are people out there who love to put holds on students. If I let everybody across my campus put a hold when they wanted to, there would be students who are denied access for $25 locker fees in the rec center and because they want that $25, and the only way they're going to get it is to put a hold on the student account. But the good thing about holds is we have immense control over them as well, and there's nothing preventing you potentially from saying, those $75 in parking fees, we're going to forget about those, or we're going to take some other fund and pay for them. And that can be critical to a lot of these students in just removing those barriers.
So this is a lot of change over a relatively quick period of time. Can you speak to the change in culture for like an advising staff when all of a sudden you're moving them all into the same building, there's 70 of them, and I would imagine they have a great increase in touch points, so their work actually feels busier?
Their work changed immensely, you're right, but the workload didn't really change. What the advisors found is they were spending much less time. In fact, we changed the prep time before every meeting, reduced that, because now we have dashboards they can look on. One screen, they see, we're actually pulling from 18 different fields in Banner on one screen, so they can see not only GPA and major, but how many D's and F's does the student have? What's their GPA trend in recent semesters? They can see financial aid holds. Does the student have a hold, or they risk at running out of eligibility because of their satisfactory academic progress and so forth? So we've reduced that part of it, but then yes, we've greatly increased the outreach component of it. We thought we would lose a lot of our existing advisors because we did become much more technologically oriented in advising, and in all frankness, we were not beforehand. 2010, it was really old school. Some of the offices were still using manila folders. That's how, advising records were kept. And so to go to this, like you say, it's 0 to 60 really quickly to use these kind of analytics. But surprisingly, we had only a few retirements or people voluntarily leaving. What we found, though, now is, and this is not intentional, but it is the reality, we tend to have a lot more people who are earlier in their careers gravitating to these positions. They're comfortable with the technology, they're comfortable with this way of interacting and so forth. So the kind of the profile of who is the best fit for these positions has changed a little bit. Used to be we'd give a really high priority. If you've been doing it for 15 or 20 years, that's great. Well, if you've been doing it for 15 or 20 years in a very different fashion, and now we want you to do it in this new fashion, that 15 or 20 years of experience isn't necessarily the same help. But I will say this, that the advisors, even those who had been here 20, 25 years, mostly adapted, and many of them are big fans now. They buy into the fact. I mean, again, it's hard to deny the results. And people like to be part, they're doing this work because they want to help students, and now it's perceptible that they're helping students in a more dramatic way than they were in the past. So that's been really positive.
Let's do one more.
One more? Okay, yes. Yes, ma'am. Hi.
First of all, I am so impressed and excited. I was communicating to my boss over at North Carolina Central University about a number of ideas we just have to start. So I commend you for your work, and it's just exceptionally impressive. I'm curious, actually, speaking about the advising piece, one of the things that we're very interested in is making sure that there are open lines of communication. And going back to what you had mentioned regarding those 800 areas of potential risk that advisors are made aware of so that they can communicate with students and try to avoid some of their potential stop-outs. I'm curious to know what type of faculty training might be in place to ensure that as faculty are working with their students, and I mentioned as early as, for some, as early as 3 weeks, some of those indicators might pop up in the system. What type of training or system is in place to make sure faculty are aware of how frequently, how often, and how effectively they can help contribute to identifying those indicators for the advisors to later to move on?
That's an important question as well. When we launched this approach, part of the goal was to stop relying on faculty in the way we had in the past, because for many years that was the only way we found out if a student was in academic difficulty, especially in the middle of a semester until final grades rolled. And it was very erratic in, sporadic, unreliable. Some students in some sections would get great support from faculty. They'd be very proactive. Other faculty, if a student didn't show up for 2 classes, would say, well, you're automatically getting a D in the class. And so, it was just all over the map. So we wanted to find a way to say, let's create an equal playing field for our students, and let's track these things more centrally. We certainly do that with most of those 800 indicators, but there are some in-semester indicators that we're using, and those are still very much faculty-driven. What we do to try to get greater participation, and this has helped immensely, is make it as easy as possible. About 3 weeks into the term, faculty get an electronic class roster. We set up categories for them to check. If a student's not having any problem, they don't have to do anything at all. But the way we've set it up is they can indicate whether a student's having attendance issues, academic performance issue, or behavioral issues. They check a box if there's any problem, more than one if there are multiple problems. And once they check the box, then there's a comment field that populates. And they can, but they don't have to add a comment. And what we try to do there, we're not trying to discourage any faculty from being much more engaged, and many are much more engaged. We have faculty on online platforms and in hybrid classes doing all kinds of innovative things to identify early on students who are struggling. But if we can get them to at least give us that bit of information 3 or 4 weeks into the semester, then what we do is we correlate all the data, and we can identify students who are really having major issues. If a student's not attending multiple classes, that's an emergency, and you need to reach out to that student immediately. So we have campaigns to get faculty to do those electronic reports. And some semesters we're up to 70 and 80% of the faculty actually completing them. And that's one of the things we've been encouraged by at Georgia State. One question I'm asked, and it came out in different forms this afternoon, is how do you get buy-in? How do you get people, it's a lot of change, how do you get them to buy into all these changes? And I'll say at a place like Georgia State, and I'm sure it's true at North Carolina Central, it's true at Duke and other institutions, people, faculty and staff who gravitate to higher education, are not doing it for the money. They're not doing it because it's the fame and glory. They're doing it, for the most part, because they really care about students. So if you can present the change as a value proposition where students will benefit, even if it doesn't mean more money in the pocket of that staff or faculty person, or doesn't mean something that's directly benefiting them in an objective fashion, that's a real value to that person. And that's what we've tried to do at Georgia State. It's another reason why I think it's important to, as you launch the change, think ahead and track the kind of data you'll need in order to articulate why it's impactful and why it made a difference. I mean, I go around, it's not just to meetings like this that I talk about Austin, Birchall. I go around our own campus and talk about Austin and remind people why we're doing this work and why it's so important. And that way, I think we're able to get much, much better buy-in. So again, thank you so much for your attention. It's been a pleasure having you.